Hey everybody, this is Mike LoPresti with a tutorial on broadcast audio mastering. It's something a lot of people have been asking about, and I wanted to make this little tutorial to show people how to do it. The key to it is quite simply getting everything to a nice, even level. Now that's not to say that you can't have some differentiation, because some things would naturally be louder than others. If somebody's screaming on camera, it needs to sound like they're screaming. But at the same time, you don't want people to have to be constantly turning the volume up and down on their TVs, their iPods. You want the least amount of distraction from the message being said. So that's sort of the aim of this whole process. This example is using it for a half-hour TV show, but you could also use it for podcasts, tutorial videos like this one. Anything where the message is more important than the beauty of the audio. Not that this damages the audio heavily, but if you don't do it right, it can. So let's get to it. Alright, so this is a half-hour show that's already been completely edited as far as the picture goes. It was a 3-camera shoot routed through a production mixer, so most of the video editing that was done in advance. We just had to cut out the extra bits, the chunks in between the takes, and long pauses, all that kind of thing, to make sure the cadence stayed even. But the bulk of the work was actually the audio. As you can see here, there's a bunch of audio cuts that had to be done, and that was because the audio recording was a 2-track recording. And the mics picked up a lot more background noise than what we'd want. The show has 2 segments. The first segment here is just the host and the guest. So each person gets their own track, but on this section over here, the second segment, we had 2 guests at the same time on one track, and one of them was much louder in the recording than the other, and that's one of the many things we have to fix. But this is Final Cut. It's not an audio editor program. You can do basic audio editing, but for the stuff we're doing today, we need to move over into an audio editor. We're going to be using Soundtrack Pro, but you could also use Pro Tools. I'm pretty sure you can use Sound Booth. But any professional audio editor should be able to do this, because all the effects we're going to be doing are based on real-world hardware pieces of equipment. So all these effects exist in all professional audio editors. So our first step here is going to be to get this whole chunk out to something else. The one upside of QuickTime versus all the other codecs is reference movies. And if I'm wrong, somebody please tell me, because I love reference movies. They are awesome, and as far as I know, QuickTime is the only thing to do it. So we need to go File, Export, QuickTime Movie. Now most people, when they export something, they always check the Make Movie Self-Contained, which you could do, but it's going to make the whole process go much longer, because it has to render out the entire movie. If you leave it unchecked, what it does is it creates a file which references the original source media. Makes a much, much smaller file, and is perfectly fine for what we want to do, because it acts just like a self-contained QuickTime movie, just smaller. Now it's not going to work if you move it computer to computer, but we're going to be staying on the same computer, so that's not a worry. Now I've already exported this here to my desktop for today, so we don't have to go through all that, but just hit save and that would render it. So next up, we got to go into Soundtrack Pro. So I'm going to switch desktops and launch Soundtrack Pro. Now Soundtrack Pro you can use as a full surround sound audio editor, but for what we're doing, we're going to sum this down to a mono mix. It's a much smaller file, it loads faster on people's phones, and you only get a tiny increase in quality really for stereo. And for a podcast or something, there's no guarantee somebody's going to be having both their earphones in, you know? So we're just going to be summing this down to mono after we're all said and done. Alright, by default, when Soundtrack Pro launches, it launches into this, which is a multi-track project, but that's not what we want. So we got to go File, Close Project, and then we'll go ahead and open this right here in Soundtrack Pro. You can either go File, Open, or you just drag it down to Soundtrack Pro. As I was editing, I panned the audio for one of the channels on the left and the other on the right to separate them well, because I can clearly see the flow of the conversation. This top is the host's conversation because it's a short question, and then the long answers of the guests. And our whole aim of all this is to, again, get it to the same level. So, and there's a couple problem areas we gotta hit, like this here. This is all guest audio here, but that's one person talking and that's another. And this one here is clearly much louder, so we need to get that down to level. Several ways we can do that. We're going to be doing 99% of what we're going to do today with a plugin called the compressor. It's based on a actual device called a compressor, not to be confused with the program compressor for making media files. There's two ways of doing it. You can either add it here as a real-time effect and tweak it as you play, or you can go up to Process Effects, and they got all the same effects here as down here. I like doing it down here because I can play it in real time and tweak it as we go. So that's what I'm going to do. So there we go. Now, downside of this method is that anything I do to one track, it's going to do to the other. But no real way around that, unfortunately. Alrighty. So let me go over what exactly a audio compressor is. A audio compressor is a dynamic gain device. It adds a certain amount of gain to a sound, but as the volume gets close to and passes a threshold set in the device, it actually will dynamically reduce that gain. The overall effect being that all the sound waves are kind of squished. The lows are gained up and the highs are squished down. It makes everything a nice even keel. It's a basic device, and it comes in all the professional audio software, but nobody seems to use it. And that's what we're going to be using today. Alright, the attack is how quickly it comes on, the release is how quickly it goes off. Now, 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. That means that the amount of time it takes for the gain to kick back in takes 1 full second. That's kind of long for my taste, so I always turn that down, but you just got to play it and tweak it to your liking. Speaking of playing it, let's play some of this. Let's just pick a chunk of audio, and I'll turn this down a little bit so it's not blaringly loud. Right. Now see this bar here, the gain reduction? That's actually going, and that's how much reduction of the gain is increasing. If we turn this release up, it's not going to drain down as fast. Whereas if we turn it down all the way, it's going to go away almost instantaneously. Got to be careful because you don't want it clipping. I like to have it in between 1 and 300 depending on the dialogue. But it's just got to be your own feel. Most compressors also come with something called a limiter, which I'll get to again later.
And there was a case that you mentioned where the...
Alright. Now the threshold here is when that kicks in. The gain is how much gain is added. I know it says that it's adding 0, but in reality it is adding gain. It's just you can add a lot more. Now, this graph here is a very useful thing, and I'm going to go over it real quick because what this is it's the speed at which the gain is increased and decreased. And the ratio here is the slope of that curve. You guys remember geometry class. It's how quickly this curve goes from pretty steep to flat. If we add this all the way up, we get this curve that just kicks it in really hard, really quickly, which I actually do pretty often as an end process after everything, but this is just going to be a preliminary run here. So we just want it to give it a progressively increasing curve.
Which way they go, and that's oftentimes.
Oh, and the knee. The knee is similar to the ratio, except the ratio affects the entire curve, and the knee only affects the apex of the curve. If you see, if I turn this down all the way, you get a point here instead of a nice curve. And as we tweak that, it stays at a point.
To make the item identifiable.
Again, that's basically personal taste. Just tweak these until it sounds good to you.
That has actually helped us
one thing I always do is turn on the limiter, because then in case somebody shouts or something and it peaks, it's not actually going to peak out and distort.
And
simple thing and very nice. Alright, so this is a real-time effect now, so we can't actually see any of the changes here, which is great for when you're editing, but I'm a visual person. I make pretty pictures for a living. I gotta see it. So to do that, we go up here to Process, Render to Action. And that's going to pause it, and it's going to re-render all this audio with that effect as part of it. And just wait a sec here, and you'll actually see what that looks like. Oh, alright, so it took a few minutes, but that render is now done. Just got to give it a sec to load. You can see it loading up here. After it's all done loading up here, we'll actually see it down here. Alright, so as you can see, that did a lot. And brought everything to one even level, but everything is still separate. And it's one thing that we need to do is get this all mixed down to a single thing. The host audio and the guest audio is still separate. Again, we're going to be outputting this mono, smaller file sizes, almost the same as far as quality goes, so really no reason not to. Best way to do that, process, convert to mono. Now, we're going to be combining left and right channels, obviously, but one thing to watch out for on this is that sometimes when you do this, you'll get something called phase cancellation. And I won't go into detail on that, but basically what can happen is your audio will actually drop as you combine these. If anybody has questions on that, let me know. Send me an email, a Twitter message, Facebook, something. I'll make a tutorial on it. But we want to combine left and right. Yeah. Alright, it's going to take it a minute. This part is much faster than actually running the audio compressor. And it's going to give us 90% of the way there by the look of it. Alright, like I said, got us 90% of the way there. This looks a lot different from what we started. There's no peaks, there's no nothing. It's one even audio level, and the whole purpose of this is you don't want to give your audience any excuse to touch that remote, at least until the next guy shows on. Because, you know, who cares about the next guy? Alright, one other thing. It looks great zoomed out like this, one solid bar, but if you zoom in on in here, in between all of here, there is background noise. Here, I'll loop some of that to play it. And we don't want that. There's no reason for us to have it. To get rid of that background noise, we're going to use the noise gate. Now, what the noise gate is exactly what it sounds like. It's a gate for noise. In order for it to allow any audio through, it has to be over a certain level. If it's over that level, it's going to let it through full bore, no problems. If it's under that, it's going to reduce it or eliminate it altogether. In this case, it's going to give it a 100 dB reduction, which for all intents and purposes is eliminating it. I loaded it as a real-time effect, but once again, if you don't like real-time effects, you can get the same thing in here. But I like real-time because I can play it and I can tweak it and tweak it to exactly what I want, and then apply it instead of tweaking, applying, tweaking, applying, tweaking, applying. All right, so we start playing this.
What having a pen pal was years ago.
When this light's on, audio is going through. If you listen in between,
and send it off and wait weeks before they get
there's no audio. The threshold affects that.
Literally, with advancing in technology, they have it at their fingertips to where they can.
And what you want to do is you want this threshold to be a little high. You want it to be high enough to get in that, but if somebody's speaking softly, you don't want it to kick out. One thing that would actually help this is to normalize this audio, which is another process. So, pause this. What normalizing does is it finds the highest peak in the entire audio and raises it up to 0. It's a very useful tool, and that's under Process, Normalize. Now what it normalizes, it analyzes the audio, finds that peak, tells me what it is, and then asks me how much gain to add. So just wait a sec. Alright, our peak level is at -4. Oh, that's 2 separate levels that I haven't spoken of about. The peak level is the absolute highest level, but this RMS level is the average audio level. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's basically what it is. Eventually we want the peak and the RMS to be as close to each other as possible. For right now this is fine, and we want it to reset the peak level. You can actually select either to 0. That's going to raise everything 4.5 dBs, which I know doesn't sound like a lot, but when I apply this, you'll see it actually does do quite a bit on the waveform. So again, small change, but at the same time, pretty big change. Now, as we go in here, there's more separation in between the dialogue and the background noise, and that's what we want. Because if there's not enough separation, we don't want to be having our noise gate clipping out dialogue. So we bring it up again.
Copper and the brass.
The noise gate has the same sort of controls as the compressor, with the exception of this hold, and that's how long it stays on before it starts releasing. And that's the minimum time. Tack and release are the same.
Has had a problem with that too while it was being built.
Release, you don't want as high as the compressor here, but you don't want it to clip off either.
We take it very seriously.
And just watch this light.
The scrap metal thefts are something that has affected our community.
When it's off, it's clipping all the audio. This is sounding pretty good and looking pretty good, so we'll go ahead and apply it. If we don't like it, we can always undo it. Soundtrack Pro has this Actions tab, so undoing something is literally just going back a step. It's quite useful. So again, Process, Render to Action will take any real-time effect and apply it, which is what we want to do. Alright, now that it's done rendering, after it loads here, we'll see what that did. Alright, so zoomed out here, we're not going to see any change, but zoomed in here, we can see that in between when people are talking, there's no background noise anymore. Soundtrack Pro has the ability to pull out background noise, and you might want to do that if it's an issue while someone's talking, but if somebody isn't talking, this is a great alternative.
For the suspect. But when we catch these individuals, we
see, yeah, it sounds fine. No real issues. We just got one last step here to do. We've taken care of the background noise. We've brought everything close to the same level, but there are still some parts that are high, and that's this upper section up here, where these peaks are just going too high. During the opens and the closes look a little hot, and in the second section, when London here is talking, he was much louder than the other gentleman. I forget his name.
Whereas back in the day,
but we want to bring that down some, but we don't want to affect the lower sections. The first time, but this same thing we can get through with the compressor as well. We just got to change our settings around a little bit. Before we had a nice gentle curve that brought up the lows a bit and shrank down the highs. Now we don't want it to affect the lows almost at all, and we want it to really bring down those highs. So to do that, we need to bring the knee down to 0. This creates a nice point. Go from no change at all in the audio to instantly a pretty decent change. Now the ratio will figure out how much change it kicks in and how quickly. For this, you want it pretty high because you want it to kick in pretty good. Alright, now you just got to play it.
People steal just for scrap.
Well, there's oftentimes it's air conditioning units and copper wires. They also.
But from the 95?
Excuse me?
But from the 95?
Alright, so here what you want to do is you want to tweak this threshold until the gain reduction is barely hitting.
And pretty much anything that's a aluminum, brass, or copper.
See, this is kicking in a little bit, but barely any. But this is a quiet section. If we go to a louder section,
1 minute things feel great.
it's kicking that in pretty good.
Or Okinawa, Japan, literally with advanced my future turnout looking for myself.
And I know your mom. It would be getting in trouble with your mom.
Now you can hear this, that the audio is actually clipping in kind of hard. So we may want to increase that knee a little bit. But a lot of this is just play, tweak, until it sounds good. Anytime you do any of these effects, you want to play it, listen to it, play it, listen to it, play it, listen to it, until you get it sounding right.
If you would like more...
Now once again, after you're all done, process, render to action, and once again you can access all these same effects without the render to action step in here. You just have to click apply and you gotta wait. And I like it better this way, but you just gotta work the way you work best. Now I know this seems hot because it's going into the red. It's not peaking. Anytime I run the compressor, the limiter's on, so it's not actually distorting. It's just riding at that higher level, which is fine. So in a minute here, it'll be all done. Alright, so render it out, and this I know looks quite odd because it looks almost like a solid bar, but if you zoom in here, it's audio, it's dialogue.
Very important.
And it oftentimes breaks down at that age.
And could use some more tweaking. Noise gate on some sections is a little intense, but all in all, it's actually pretty even keel. Alright, so now this is too hot to actually broadcast. It's at positive 6 dBs, and the standard broadcast volume is at negative 12. But the dB meter here actually acts more like a UV meter. So I'm only going to bring this down to negative 6 because that's actually going to be negative 12 in Final Cut Pro. Because for all intents and purposes, we're all done in here. So once again, normalize is the best way to change the overall audio level. It's also a great meter because it finds the peak. It finds the average levels and tells you. See, the average level is actually negative 3. But we want to peak out. We'll only peak out at 0 for this. And once again, just gotta wait for it to render out. And after we actually bring that down, it looks a lot more normal because Soundtrack Pro doesn't let us see beyond 0 on the audio waveform. So zooming out here, you can see that it's all at a pretty nice even keel now. There's no distortion. Our audience is going to want to touch their remote less, which is the goal of any production. So we're all done in Soundtrack, so we need to send it back. There's a couple ways of doing that. You can either just save the audio project file, or you can actually create a AIF, which is a finished self-contained sound file. I like to create the AIF. I've had some linking issues with the Soundtrack profiles, so change this file name to finished audio. And it warns me that it's going to have to flatten it, saving it this way. But if I ever want to, I can always go back to the original. I haven't touched that yet, and I'm not going to touch that. I'm not going to delete the original audio. I'm just going to hide it. It's still going to be there, it's just I won't hear it. Which is fine, because... Alright, now that that's done, quit out of Soundtrack Pro and go back into Final Cut. And we're going to import that file we just made. Alright, so this is a mono audio file, and we got these 4 tracks of mono audio files, but I don't want to get rid of them. And the best method I found is just to put it underneath everything at the very beginning, because then I don't have any sync issues, and then click these green buttons on all the audio tracks, and then I'll mute everything else. So now I'm only going to hear my finished audio.
His own teenager.
You want to check it, make sure it's still in sync.
Foul language on that, and wouldn't know.
There we go. That's it. Now we're good to go and output onto tape, create YouTube files, whatever's needful. So once again, I'm Mike LoPresti, and that was broadcast audio mastering. Thank you, and if you have any questions, please send me a message. Alright, see y'all later.